Since May of 2014, Neil has been the White House counsel, and as White House counsel to President Obama, and I think he'll tell you something about this, advises the President on all legal and constitutional issues across a broad spectrum of domestic and foreign affairs issues. He clerked on the Third Circuit. He clerked for Chief Justice Berger. We were baby prosecutors together a long time ago in the Southern District of New York. He was after that stint as an assistant U.S. attorney, he was deputy chief counsel of the congressional committee that investigated the Iran-Contra affair. He had one earlier stint in the Clinton administration in the White House counsel as an associate White House counsel, so he got some insight then as to the kind of things that he has to deal with now. We worked together in a number of matters when he was in private practice, both at Kirkland & Ellis and Debevoise in Plimpton. And I'll just tell you, a general counsel in one of the largest companies in the country recently told me when we were talking about Neil that he literally is the best lawyer that she had ever dealt with. And I can tell you he is regarded as one of the finest legal minds and lawyers in the United States. So Neil, we look forward to hearing from you.
So Sandy, thanks for that introduction. I'm a little worried I can't possibly live up to especially the last couple sentences, because people are going to wonder who that general counsel is and send her an email by the time I'm done. But so anyway, thanks for that. Thanks to everybody for inviting me. And I reviewed the program before I came over, and it just seemed like a terrific program, and so pleased I'm obviously a member of the section, or I may not be much of a member now because my income dropped somewhat significantly when I went from Kirkland. I'll tell one quick story about this. There's, I think I can mention his name, maybe I shouldn't, but anyway, Tom Donlan, who many of you know, was a partner at Imovany & Myers and then came in to be the National Security Advisor at the beginning of the administration. And he tells the story that his wife came to him shortly after he came and pointed to an entry on their bank statement and said, "What is this? Is this your reimbursement for travel expenses?" And he said, "No, that's our salary, as long as I'm National Security Advisor." So, so public service, I'm not quite pro bono, but there are days when it feels a little like it. Anyway, I thought what I would do is just talk for a few minutes about my office and how it's organized, and then I wanted to focus more specifically on the things that the President has done in the criminal justice space during the course of the administration. The ones I think of as I make my notes are largely the ones that have happened since I've been there, so I'm sure there are others I've left off the list. But let me talk, and then I thought I would open it for questions. To the extent people might have questions about the White House counsel and the way that operates, I wanted to make sure there was time for that if people have anything that they would like to ask me. Just in terms of my office, I have well, first I have an office in the West Wing of the White House. Some of you have been there. I think it's one of the, it's not the Oval, but it's one of the coolest offices in the White House. It's on the second floor in the West Wing. It's got this great paneling. Bernie Nussbaum, who was the first White House counsel in the Clinton administration, came by a couple of months ago and looked at it and said, "Well, Neil, it looks great, but it's the exact same furniture that was there when I was White House counsel, and you can kind of tell it's the White House, but it's still government after all. So things like that don't work so well." I've got roughly 40 attorneys. You'd think I'd know exactly, but it's a little bit of how you count. There are attorneys on the national security staff that I regard as kind of mine, but they're not on really on my payroll. There are vetting attorneys who do backgrounds of nominees and the like, not really on my payroll, but they report to somebody with. So I include them. I include them in my events, and so I think of them as kind of mine. They're roughly divided. We have an oversight group, which, as you might guess, particularly since we lost the Senate, has been quite active since for the last 2 years. Most of the time I've been there, we've not had either the House or the Senate, and so that's made their job pretty active. There's a group that does clemency and judges. I'm going to come back and talk about clemency in a second. There's a group that does ethics and then is heavily involved in the transition as you might guess, we're spending a lot of time on the transition at the moment. I mentioned to somebody that it's remarkable for all the political people in the White House, which are most of the people, you know, there's nothing left in the White House when the new administration comes in. There's not a piece of paper, there's not an email, there's not a document on a server. That's all, it's not disposed of, mind you, but it's all transferred. it's unless somebody get the wrong idea here, it's all it's all transferred over to the National Archives. And so, but the new administration really comes in with pretty much of a blank slate. And I think that's part of the reason that the transition itself is so important as we sort of convey to them our views about the way things have done. They can always do them differently if they would like to do. But we really feel that this transition is really important. The transition from Bush to Obama was terrific. They were complete professionals and very helpful and collaborative, and we want to be just as good in the transition to whomever the next president might be. So there's a group of lawyers in my office heavily involved in that. There's a policy group that does all sorts of things. Some people in the room probably like our immigration executive actions, and some probably don't, but that came up largely through that group. We did a bunch on guns. We've done sort of various things, and that's largely goes up through that group. A lot of the really tough litigation goes through them as well. Obviously, all sort of being involved with the Justice Department. And then there's the other area is national security, which is I'm the senior lawyer giving advice to the president on national security matters. This is, in some ways, when I started, was the scariest thing for me because I had no experience in this at all. I think every once in a while, I don't know how many people are New York Times readers, but I'm a regular New York Times readers, and I'm so old that I actually read that physical paper. So, so you know how the first few pages, after the first page, are essentially international law. Then it's a couple pages in to get to the national section. Basically, before I started this job, I never read the international laws, the international sections. I didn't really care. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't really understand it. And so I show up. I didn't have much of a background in this. And then shortly after I got there, of course, the fight with ISIL started. And so I needed to learn that law pretty quickly. Had great deputies to teach it to me. Now I find that I read the international sections with just as much vigor because typically it's something I'm working on because that's what tends to end up in the newspaper. So that's a little bit how the office is organized. Most of my lawyers are in what's now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, a couple of us in the West Wing of the White House. So that's, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. I thought I'd just give people a little flavor about how that operates. So I see the president basically every day when he's in town, not, well, I should probably say average of every day when he's in town. Sometimes I see him a couple times a day, sometimes I don't, but probably an average. I don't really travel with him. I sort of got myself on a few trips, mostly because wasn't because he really needed me, although I think I was value added. I'm not sure he thought I was value added, but mostly I wanted to ride on Marine One, the helicopter from the South Lawn of the White House, out to Andrews Air Force Base and then get on Air Force One, and so that was pretty cool. And so I needed to be able to do that a couple times before I left. So let me just tell you a little bit about where we've been in criminal justice. First, I just want to talk about clemency. And I know that there are people in this room who have really been working on the Commutations Project, and I can hardly be more thankful of all the work people have done. I think Jim Feldman is here, and he has been a stalwart both of the overall effort as well as submitting petitions. So this was announced shortly after I started in 2014, and obviously it wasn't doable by the Justice Department and the White House itself. There was just no way to process this number and figure out which the right ones were to grant and which ones were the right ones to deny, and we really needed the private bar to step up, and Jim and others, both, as I say, both individually and also as part of the Clemency Project 2014, really stepped it up. I spent a lot of time talking to them, and they've just did a fantastic job. So we are currently at, 874, I think, roughly, commutations, largely drug sentences that were reduced. About a third of those were serving life at the time they got their commutation. Those are particularly rewarding to me. And in addition, we have done about 70 pardons. I can tell everybody in the room that the commutations and that there'll be an increase of the pardons, and that we got a lot of time left, and we are far, excuse me, we are far from being done. So we will keep going, and particularly appreciative of the work everybody's done to get those petitions to the Department of Justice so they can make a recommendation and get them to my office. I've got people who are going to stay to the end in my office, and we're going to process everything we possibly can to get them to the President's desk, and that is his instruction, excuse me, to me. So anyway, I want to talk about that, and I want to particularly recognize Jim for his fantastic work on this. The other thing I was heavily involved in at the time was shortly after Ferguson, the President set up the Policing Task Force in the 21st century, and really remarkable, Lori Robinson and Chuck Ramsey. Lori having been in the Justice Department, Chuck, who was the police chief, I guess at the time of Philadelphia, although I think he'd also been the police chief in D.C., if I'm remembering correctly, and maybe a few other places, chaired the committee, or the commission. And there were student activists on the committee, there were academics, there were civil rights leaders, and they really came together and did just a remarkable job of putting together real practical recommendations. I called each of them, pretty much all of them, and asked them if they would serve. And they all said, well, you know, how long is it going to take and how big a job is it going to be? I said, don't worry, you can do it. It'll be a few hearings. It's no big deal. So then, which I knew it wasn't true when I told them. And so when it was over, and then they were hoping they'd get more time. We gave them 90 days, but there was kind of a dispute from when the 90 days started. They wanted it to be from when the President formally announced them. And we decided it had to be 90 days from when he first mentioned it, and it cut about 30 days of their time off. They were pretty unhappy with that. But they came up with just what the President wanted was practical solutions and practical recommendations that police forces could implement, and that's exactly what he got. And this is obviously post-Ferguson, and the most amazing thing of that whole process, both because of the work of the Department of Justice and because of Chuck and Lori and others on the commission, is that it's not one of these documents that's just been on the shelf somewhere. It's really been implemented. The various police chief associations and sort of line officer associations have really adopted it and embraced it. And it's one of the most rewarding things I've done, really, since I've been there. Just a couple other things I wanted to mention. Obviously, working hard on criminal justice reform legislation. I say all the time I'm still hopeful. I am still hopeful. I get that the time for it being done in this administration is getting a little cramped, but I'm still hopeful. It's one of these remarkable Washington stories, which there's tremendous bipartisan support, as you all know. The Koch brothers on one side and Center for American Progress on the other are both strongly in favor, have been lobbying members of Congress to pass it. Senator Durbin on one side and Senator Cornyn on the other side are both very strong proponents, and yet, you know, we're in Washington in 2016 for reasons I can't figure out. It's just not getting through. But I'm hopeful that before the President's term is over, that it'll be enacted and it'll get to the President's desk. Just a couple other things. Some of these now are more in the Justice Department. The Justice Department really recently announced limitations on the use of solitary confinement, which I think were well deserved, and were really thoughtful. I don't know how many people have followed that, but really significant limitations on the use of solitary confinement and the duration of solitary confinement, including an outright ban on solitary confinement for juveniles. In addition, this is more out of the White House, have pushed ban the box very strongly. That's as I think probably people in the room know, not having to identify whether you have a conviction in the initial employment application. We've done what we can for federal contractors, but remarkably, businesses have really signed up and have agreed with this. There's some recent, the head of Uber was in the other day, and they had sort of loosened that requirement in their application process. Again, this is a delay. It's not a not ask at all. It's really a delay, but which resulted in the hiring of more people who had some kind of a record. And then since they're so data-oriented, they've been able to really see whether that has an impact on the quality of their drivers, and it has had none. So it's really been a remarkable thing for them. And a lot of work being done in reentry by the Department of Justice and education and prison. It's just, as you all know, a remarkable number of people in jail and come out, and we just have to give them, excuse me, a chance when they come out to be able to succeed, which is a large part of what the president's trying to do through the Clemency Project. And then I'm going to explain one more, which is sort of hard to explain, but I really like it, so I couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk about it. So the White House, and I think that one or more foundations will probably keep this going even if the next White House is not interested. We're trying to get much more into data, and there's a lot you've read. The FBI is going to try to get a lot more data on police shootings and the like. But there's an initiative called Data-Driven Justice that I really like. It turns out that in large municipal areas, and one of actually the biggest where this has been successful is Miami, essentially a very small group of the same people consume most of the resources. They are the ones that are in and this is not federal jails. Now, they're in and out of jails repeatedly. They're in and out of the emergency rooms of the various different hospitals. And they're sort of in and out of mental treatment facilities. And it's really the same people. And it's because they're just passed from one institution to the other. And I don't remember the statistics now, but a very small number of people account for a shocking proportion of days either in an emergency room or in a prison facility. And this is a method to try to identify who those people are. Excuse me, I've got a little allergy going. Try to identify who those people are and get them into treatment facilities because they're in these situations essentially because they're homeless, they're mentally ill, and yet we've given the police really are the ones who end up being the principal sort of first responders, not just when there's a crime take place, but whenever anything happens in society with regard to somebody who's either homeless or mentally ill or whatever. And it's a way to try to divert those resources away from the police. And the various places where this is being adopted, they're having much better outcomes for the individuals and at a significant reduction in cost. And so it's a little hard to explain, but it's one that was adopted and really developed by the White House that I think has just done tremendous work. So anyway, I think I've gone on longer than I meant to go on. In initial remarks, I'm happy to take any questions from anybody. I'm sorry, the reason I looked at my cell phone, which is super rude, is to say, because I wasn't sure when it was going to announce, we, excuse me, just now announced another 72 computations. So, obviously I knew when it was coming, but I couldn't do it until it was public. And so I also knew I was going to look at my cell phone, and if I didn't then give you good news, you're all wondering why I was looking at my cell phone. So I'm very pleased, actually, that it was, oh, thank you, I appreciate it. So I'm pleased that I was able to report something. Anyway, any questions from anybody? I'm happy to take a question. Yes?
Can you say anything about the relationship between the Office of Legal Counsel and the Justice Department and your office?
Sure. So, yeah, so first I just want to say there's been a little bit in sort of the academic world critical recently of the Office of Legal Counsel, and I completely reject it. And Jack Goldsmith, who's a terrific guy at Harvard, has been writing a little bit about it. My view is this happens to all of us. We probably say the same thing about the office. Everybody says it was better when I was there. So I think there's a little of that going on with Jack. I've said that to his face, mind you. So if he hears I said that, he will not be surprised. I think they just do a fantastic job. I consult with them all the time. The current head of it, not confirmed, but the head of it is a guy named Carl Thompson, very smart. And so I consult with them on legal issues frequently. I think there's been a drop-off in written opinions. I think he would say there's been a bit of a drop-off in written opinions. I don't know if that's because the world moves so quickly that it's hard. Usually you have to decide and move on, and so it's harder to get a written opinion from them because those tend to be issues that are a little bit more long-term. But they're consulted widely. They're consulted by me. They're consulted by other agencies. They're intimately involved in what. Look, I spend a lot of time doing sort of legal risk assessments, as you might guess, and among the places I call to get that kind of advice is the Office of Legal Counsel. I think they do a fantastic job, and I use them heavily, and I think they're highly regarded throughout the administration. They're mostly, as you know, I don't know, they're mostly career. I can't even remember how many there are there. I spoke to them not too long ago. Now I don't remember. I could sort of count around the table, but they're almost all career, I think.
Hi. I'm assuming the commission that you referred to earlier was the one where Ramsey from Philadelphia was the
Yes.
chair?
Yes.
And my question was, and I've asked a lot of people this question, but I think you're the person to answer it, why were there no prosecutors on that commission?
So I think that we thought, no, that's a good question. I think that we thought that it was, that the ultimate issue, it was post-Ferguson, and we thought that the ultimate issue was not in prosecution, it was how police officers and communities should relate to each other. And one thing I felt strongly about is that it had to be small enough to actually be functional. And so I just really thought through, who is it who really has expertise about this particular issue? And there were lots of people who wanted to serve. There were a lot of other people I thought would be useful in bringing expertise to it. But I had to balance it against getting it to be so big that it actually isn't functional. And so I just made a judgment that they were important, but there's that whole thing that we say in the White House all the time, which is must-have or nice-to-have, and frequently you can only end up with the must-haves, and you can't really do the nice-to-haves. I regarded prosecutors as would have been helpful, but not that, because the issue really had to do with relations between police and community. I decided that I had to trade it off against an increase in the size, and so I just made that judgment. It could be criticized. The one thing I've learned about working in the White House is that everything we do is criticized. So that is never a grounds for not doing something or doing something, because it doesn't matter what we do. So you could you could definitely criticize us for not having to do it, and maybe you're right, but that was the way I thought about it. Anybody else? I'm here. Yeah.
One significant move by the Department of Justice that you didn't mention, but really caught my attention, was when DOJ weighed in on fixed bail schedules. And I'm curious if that was something that you were involved in, and if so, what was the calculus in terms of making a fairly rare kind of intervention in lower courts?
Right.
And also to recognize the effort, and thank you.
Sure. So first, I think that was a letter that Vanita Gupta, the head of the Civil Rights Division, if I'm remembering correctly, sent largely to state systems. So it's even more than just lower courts. I think it's less of an issue, obviously, as people here know, in the federal system, because it's a little different. I knew that they were doing it. I was not actually particularly involved in it. So that did not originate with me. I was highly supportive of it. I actually think that, there's the kid with the backpack in New York, for example. I think that the impact of having fixed schedules that then result in people spending significant periods of time in jail just has such a massive impact. And you all know better than I do that the plea statistics are much higher among people who end up in jail, presumably because their lawyers say to them, look, if you plea, I'll get you time served and you'll get out. But then they're in the criminal justice system, and they have a fine they have to pay, and they're on probation, and they miss work because they have to go see their probation officer. And this is part of, to me, is part of giving everybody a chance to succeed and get through the criminal justice system. Obviously, I don't want to, lots of people belong in the criminal justice system, and lots of people deserve life sentences. So lots of people needed to be heavily punished as a result of what they do. That's not where we are on this. It's the people who are a little caught up around the fringes who end up having their lives so significantly impacted. I think that we just have to continue to think about solutions that give people outs, if you will. And I think, so I thought that was a terrific initiative by them. It was unusual. Now, because it was sent to the state systems over which we really have no particular control. But it's a good question. But I was a huge fan of that. Let me go here first, I'll go there.
I was just going to ask if you want to talk a little bit about the relationship similar to what you did before between the White House counsel and the Solicitor General's office.
Sure. So I think in some ways similar, obviously independent, and guards their independence quite strongly. because they're a voice to the Supreme Court, and I think it's important to everybody that the Supreme Court recognizes they're not just sort of a political tool. They are absolutely not. I had occasion, just to do a little plug here, I had occasion to see Don Verrilli. One of the advantages of my job is I get 3 tickets to all the arguments, so I got to go to all the big arguments while I was there, and I saw Don Verrilli argue several times some of the biggest cases. He's an amazing lawyer. So I would talk to him from time to time about cases, and particularly, I didn't typically talk to him about cases that didn't really involve us. So ACA, I was there for the second ACA case. Obviously, that's a significant presidential initiative, and so I talked to him about that case, for example. But I didn't tell him how to argue it or how to brief it, and there are various others. The immigration case that we ended up, it just hurts me to say losing. It was a 4-4 tie, which was a loss. So that was a significant presidential initiative, so I would talk to Don about that. But they're independent. They also, as you know, are largely career and are fantastic lawyers. So I think we got a good relationship with them as well. I mean, but they're quite independent, and they do a really good job of it, I think. I think there was one over here, yeah.
Neil, is there any chance the administration will reconsider its position on mens rea reform?
So here's what I think I mean, I'm not sure where you're, I'm not sure that everybody in the room knows what our position is. I mean, we have been generally opposed
I don't think we do either.
Well, I think we've been generally opposed to some of the bills up there that would sort of across the board simply change the mens rea standard. But exactly where that is like everything else a matter of a lot of discussion. Although if in a lot of these things, if it's not moving anywhere, then we don't have to get down to the hard decisions basically. And it doesn't look like it's moving, although as I say, I certainly hope it does. So that was a little bit of a non-answer. I got that. Anybody else? Yeah.
On a very different topic, any updates or positions you can offer on efforts to close Guantanamo?
So what we are doing, as you've, and it's really picked up significantly, I would say, in the last year, maybe last year and a half, is that we're really pushing hard to move out everybody we can possibly move out. As you know, there's a rider that bars transfer to the United States. And so we're trying to do everything we can. There are these things, I always get the acronym wrong, but PRBs, something like that. Anyway, there are these review boards at DOD that's going back through everybody and trying to make an assessment of whether it would be appropriate to transfer them to another country pursuant to the statute. I think they're working hard on that. There's been a lot done in the last year, and I think we're just trying to get the number down as much as we possibly can. And the more the number gets down, the more expensive per detainee it ends up. And so we're hoping there'll be some sense between that and the notion there are lots of terrorists already in the U.S. prison who are being held and are not a threat, that we hope that people will recognize that the system can handle these okay. But I think our real goal is pursuant to the statute, doing a review, making a determination of whether they can be transferred out, and getting that done as much as we can. That's essentially what the plan is, I think. I probably have time for one more, and then I have to run off. Yeah.
Here's the last question. Were you working harder at the White House counsel's office, or were you at Kirkland?
So here's so I would say I'm actually going to tell a funny story about this, which is, so a lot's harder. The thing about private practice, it was much more hills and valleys. You're on trial, you're working all the time, and you're basically out of town. But then if you're not, at least for me, there was a little more time. It's just always at the top, 7 days a week, every week, week in and week out. And mind you, my kids are gone. I've been married for 33 years. I'm not complaining. I'm working for this President of the United States, so this is not a complaint. There's no place I'd rather be than doing what I'm doing. But I was at a party shortly after I started, and so my wife is like 10 feet away, not in our conversation, but in a conversation with other people, and I hear somebody say to her, "What's it like that he works all the time?" And she said, "Well, you don't get it. When he was at Kirkland, he was gone 2, 3, 4 nights a week, and at least he comes home every night in this one. So in some ways, I'm at home a lot more than I used to be because at least I sleep in my own bed every night, which was not true at either Debevoise or at Kirkland. So that's nice. Get to see my spouse, my dog. In that order, mind you, in case this is recorded. I just want to be clear here. Anyway, thanks to everybody. I really appreciate it.